We're living in the data era. The data defines and differentiates us. New rules abound, and every day new ones are coming. And at the same time, new threats are coming even more. So with that, with that changing happening every day, the new data threats and new data opportunities, what we'd like to think about is, some of the things we hear from our clients and how do we, address those, and what's the right approach, the best practices that we're seeing and working with our clients on in terms of how do you address this. And so some of the common misconceptions or entry points into the conversation is the classic backup conversation. That the debate about, how many copies of your backup do you have? How long do you keep them? Where do you put them? And is there an air gap? And what does that even mean? And can I see my data? And we've seen some pretty interesting and very recent changes in that world. Classically, people had, a primary, a secondary, and even a tertiary copy. And they would keep it for some period of time. Usually they had a retention policy that might, say they keep, full backups for a year, and then monthly, and then snapshots, and proceed away through that hierarchy, the grandfather, father, son sort of model. But then came ransomware and new things happened. And people started to approach this differently. And the idea came of an air gap. And you'll hear in many cases, well, the comeback of tape is that's the ultimate air gap. And we still see those questions going on. But even more recently, recent political events have caused people to say, I'm not sure I even trust big data. I want to see a copy of my data. And they don't really mean they get to see their data. They want to see a physical box. And we've seen quite a few, client requests over the last few weeks where people saying, I want to see my data in my facility. And one client recently, we had a phone call with who said, they wanted one. In fact, they bought a copy, a device, put it on top of the refrigerator in their break room, because now they had their data. They were sure where it was going to be. All of those things introduce new questions and new challenges. And so really, what do you want to approach, and how are you going to, solve that question? Because as you move forward, take that example where you move to a copy inside your own data center. Well, the data can be mobile, particularly in that example in a break room. So while you may have solved the ransomware problem, you've got an air gap copy that sits physically remote and you know exactly where it is. It's now mobile. That can be taken. And all that corporate data, while it's not ransomware, it's been intellectual property, can easily be taken and pilfered for ill gains. So, and you, at the same time, you also have the question of the more copies I make, how do I protect that data? And how do I ensure privacy, the rights to be forgotten, those questions that start to come up on how do I find all of that data? And tape, as an example, is very difficult to solve that problem. Right? Because now I need to recover all that. I can't online see that. So there's always this balance of protecting from a ransomware attack at the same time protecting your data for your corporate value and personal privacy. And that whole question of, if I have it, am I able to use it? Having a tape copy that's remote miles away may take days to recover your business. And recovery times are critical. And so you need to sort of really think through, how am I going to be able to, go through all of that? So how are we addressing that? Well, the first step really is going to start with the discussion of architecture. And that may not sound like a conversation around simplicity. Architecture sometimes starts to sound like complexity. But actually, if you actually think about it, architectures, if they're simple, they're easy to communicate, allows you to build, deploy, operate, and evolve. And it's going to be based on standards. Now, that's not different for data than it is for compute, and sort of the evolution of cloud is all based on the notion of standardization. But your agile processes, as you do more development, as you get more data, as you look for more from your data, that agile requires that basic simplicity and that enforcement of those standards. And when you get through all of that, it's going to be about software. So if I look to the right in that picture, it's a very complex picture. It's a, what I will call a block diagram of an architecture. So what I really want to make sure you think about here is your data is in a lot more places than it used to be. It's no longer a database inside of the data center. You have everything from the edge devices to things that sit in a hyperscale cloud, that's things that sit in a private cloud, and things that are not cloud at all, just legacy environments, traditional architecture, if you will. And they're all interconnected, whether it's through co-location cross connects or whether it's through SD-WAN or traditional WAN technologies. The point is, all of that represents your data footprint. And for all of that, you need a consistent way to look at your data and manage the storage and the data across that environment. And so we introduced that as a notion of a data and a storage plane. On top of that, you need some method of saying, how am I going to protect all this data? And then on top of that, you need to look at, where are the users coming from and how are they going to access those applications, and how am I going to assure the performance of those applications that are all dependent on the access of that data? And then finally, how's that going to interact into my service management environment? Now, increasingly, the best practice is for as much of those tools, both the storage, the data, and the application and the infrastructure management to be SaaS-based. Well, for a few reasons. One is the obvious, is it allows you to span that entire environment. You're no longer trying to figure out what sits in one environment versus another. So increasingly, you see the trend to moving, all of that should be SaaS-based. You also see increasing evidence of integration with the service management. Classically, certainly a dominant player in that environment is ServiceNow. But as you move below that now I've got, a notion of events. How am I going to connect all these pieces together? So if I look across that, as our sponsor of this event, Cisco, we would look to Cisco Intersight. Now, what does that mean? So Cisco Intersight gives you that SaaS-based tool that allows you to look across all of that infrastructure. And then down below that, one example you might have is Pure Storage and their Pure1 management tool. And so it's not just simply one thing to say, do you have the right tool, but can you integrate them? And that's the point of the discussion of architecture, because I need to be able to integrate those pieces together from an end-to-end environment. I need to be able to start to look at events and evoke policies. And actually, instead of debating the, moving up from LUNs and the individual tools for individual storage devices, it's absolutely critical that I actually look at the data independent of which device it sits on, and how am I going to manage the policies and the movement of that data, both to optimize costs as well as to optimize accessibility and performance of that. It takes a concerted effort. It takes a continual effort to make sure that you've got the pieces integrated, and choosing those right tools allows you to move very quickly, and very importantly, allows you to focus on policies instead of worrying about device management techniques. So one example we put forward there is the notion of Pure spanning that end-to-end environment, a SaaS-based cloud storage and data management tool, integrated in with Cisco Intersight, all able to communicate with ServiceNow. And now you've got an architecture. Underpinning all of that is the notion of a security architecture. And that has to be, connected across all of those environments. Not only do you have more threat surfaces, obviously you have a lot more of activity that you need to understand those network connections. And we've all heard the stories where an air conditioning, maintenance port or a service tool or something allowed access into those environments. I'm getting a lot of significant press lately. And suddenly all of your data is exposed. It's critically important you have that connected architecture and you understand every point that's going to be available for access. In many cases, and this is an example with one of our key partners, Pure Storage, where they start to say, can I deliver that same storage environment that I'm used to on-premise with the same enterprise policies in that cloud environment. Again, that consistency through architecture of managing those tools, of managing that outcome. Now, key to this is making it easier, making it simpler. One value of that extension into the cloud with consistent policies and tooling is allows you to make that one investment in automation and policy, that one policy, your run book, all of the pieces you're going to do to build and manage and architect that environment done once and done consistently. The next step in there, of course, is understanding the speed of that infrastructure. Now, certainly in the cloud, you can make choices about the speed of that environment, and I can move things between different tiers within that environment. But in all cases, as we've seen the move to hyperconverged, as we've seen the move to flash storage and NVMe, the key element we see across all of this is performance is critical. The user experience in a digital world defines whether or not you retain that client. And the performance of that storage, which is many cases the gating item to this performance of the application, given the size of the data sets and the size of the object files and things like that, that those applications are dependent on, then that is absolutely critical to delivering that user experience. So while you can choose that high-speed storage inside of the cloud, you also want to be able to make that same choice inside your current environment. And that extends as well to things like your analytics. If I can build my data modeling, if I can actually get the benefit of the analytic outcomes faster, I can make decisions faster, and I can reap competitive advantage. Now, beyond that, though, there is also then the note of resilience, right? We talk a lot about backup copies, but how fast do you recover? When we started, I mentioned things like, tape and how fast it takes, or how long it takes rather, to move that tape in a truck, a van, a car to some other facility where then it can be uploaded and recreate your production environment. Now, in the past, people would, go to what we would use the term active-active, two hot data centers with actually, synchronized data between the two environments. But that was very expensive. It required the data centers to be within a certain distance and restricted really to a certain set of applications that could benefit from that environment. However, when you start to talk about the speed of recovery available through some of these environments, and this is an example of, again, a notion of Cisco with Pure, but in this case with Cohesity, combining to deliver an ultra-fast recovery option. Now that means you don't have to go through the complexity of active-active, for those of you who know those terms, and actually look at performing, best-in-class policy placement, backup and protection guarantees, ransomware protection, and at the same time, delivering performance, simplicity, and scale. And that's the way people are starting to now really rethink about how will they architect their environments and how will they rethink disaster recovery and business resilience. That makes that data available to the business, and business resilience has overtaken the notion of disaster recovery. And by that, I mean people can't afford an outage, but they also can't afford active-active. They need to take advantage of the new values of the new technologies and what the new architectures allow. And with this, you have the simplicity of the kinds of tools you know how to operate at the same time with the availability that gets you to near zero outages. Now, along with that comes the notion of security. Now, obviously, security is a key element in ransomware, and every day there's a new threat, there's a new phishing attack. You've all experienced that, and you're going to continue to experience that, whether it's nation threats or whether it's just people attacking your business for personal gain. Now, you have your own sets of challenges. Finding, recruiting, and retaining that security expertise, in some cases, is impossible. You may be too small. In other cases, it's just hard to get. And in other cases, it just simply, the more data you have, the more experiences you have, the better you get. And so it's very difficult for many businesses to see and experience enough activity to understand the latest threats and to have the insights to correlate those threats against the individual activity that's happening. And so understanding how to do that, but you also have to have enough visibility. You know, there's a lot of folks who will go to surgery in a small town for simple things. But when it comes to very complex, they don't want to go to the place where the doctor has seen it once. They want to go to the place where that doctor has done that particular surgery maybe 5 times that day. And that's that notion of that skill by virtue of having a broad base of clients to work with. And then keeping up that with that growing attack surfaces. How do I extend? So for example, if I'm detecting responses and I've got a really good process and approach inside my own data center, can I extend that to those infrastructure that sits in the cloud? And do you have the ability to invest in a series of playbooks? Playbooks and automation is critical as you do this. Now you have to be careful to avoid false positives and not overreact and overly disrupt your business. But it's important to be able to understand that I have a way to execute, a way to define when an event has to occur, and then I have a way to be able to respond to that in a repeatable manner once I've made the determination of where the threat is and how do I isolate it. Now, time to response is absolutely critical. Those days that you have a problem is an ever living threat to your business, and the financial impacts get higher. And particularly the later you discover it, the financial impacts get bigger because it has better chance to penetrate further into your business. And at the same time, it also will elongate your recovery time. So you may not have the latest data. You may have to go to a backup copy that might be 6 or 7 months old. That's a lot of business that you have to, come back and recover against because you couldn't find a good copy, within that period of time. So understanding, detecting, and responding to that threat is absolutely critical. Now, how do we help? So Aspire can be an extension of your security operations. Today we do this what we call our managed detection and response service. And what we do is focus visibility across your entire attack surface. The cloud, the network, and the endpoints, whether or not your infrastructure sits in the cloud or it sits on premise, where your endpoints are and how they're spanning that environment. And it's through that advanced threat intelligence, absolutely staying current on the latest threats using some of the latest tools. So we have visibility to all the new threats, and we can provide that faster detection with the experience, because we've seen this for other clients and we've seen it in other parts of the country. How do we respond to that, and how do we quickly come down to an indication of you're seeing something abnormal, and what action do you want us to take working with you as your trusted partner? So what do we look at, right? We look at, across the DNS layer, the firewall, the network traffic, the endpoint protection, and really that whole threat intelligence model. And really with that expert team of analysts and responders, be able to drive that continuous monitoring, alert triage, et cetera. And this is really critical. In that picture, you see our managed services appliance sitting in the middle. But what's really critical here is the time to response. If you look at the analyst, Gartner says this is the modern model. It's not about a static firewall. There are going to continually be threats. This is not also in lieu of a firewall. This is in addition to a firewall, but it's about responding to the threat once you know it's there and not discovering later. And we have seen quite a few clients who have been under attack but not known it, have not recognized it for a long period of time. And that's a very difficult recovery model. The sooner you can get it isolated and then react to it, the better off you're going to be. So what's that process, right? It's triggered by some alarm through a detection. The analysis is the core part, right? The analysis and the investigation where we sit down and look at all those things, given the knowledge of the latest threat environment, and come back to you with a recommended response. Now, the perfect balance. And in the end, right, you really need to be able to say, I have a data policy that spans my entire landscape, that you can simplify your management, and this is absolutely critical. The broader it gets, the more inconsistent your tools are, the more difficult it's going to be. If I can look at data regardless of whether it's sitting at the endpoint in an IoT solution perhaps, versus if I can look at that inside my own data center or I can sit in a cloud, if I can simplify out all of that into a consistent policy-driven approach, then I can apply the best practices. And I can do that across the board. And then I can drive, the speed of the infrastructure, whether it's in the cloud, across the WAN, or, on my on-premise data center, to ensure that I have the speed of access to the data and also an infrastructure recovery model so that I can deliver a fast response to any situation. And on top of that, that security focused on protection, detection, and response. You bring those pieces together, and you've actually delivered what I will call the best practice for modern protection in a simple but effective way to protect your data and make it available for your business across the board. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to thank everyone for participating. I don't know if there are any questions in the chat room, but I'll hold for a moment and see if there are. And if not, again, I will thank everyone for participating. And please, if there are questions, reach out to Aspire, and we can certainly help you, whether it's for the infrastructure side, the data policy side, or the security side. Thanks again and have a great day.